Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting this garden scene. I've always wanted to paint a full garden and I saw a comment saying they'd want to see me paint a secret garden, which I'm guessing is more hidden and magical or mysterious. I'm not really sure, but here's my take on it. Like usual, I'm going to mask the sides so I can get a nice clean frame. And while I do this, let me show you the reference photos that I decided to use. I'll also link them in the description box so you can take a better look at them if you need to. So this is the first reference photo that I picked. I like the idea of a path leading to an opening surrounded by plants and colorful flowers, and this is probably something that I would imagine if someone mentioned a secret garden. This is the second image that I found, and I love that the rose bush here is shaped like an arch, so I thought that I would incorporate this for the entryway of the secret garden. As for this image, I love the mist and the light. I feel like this looks mysterious and it would be nice to put it behind the entryway of the composition as a nice contrast from the entrance. Okay, so now I just want to map out the composition. These are going to be painted freehand mostly, but I want to make sure that the arch is centered horizontally, which is why I'm drawing that out. And I also want a clear pathway heading towards the arch. At the same time, I also want to map out the plants for the background, so I'm really careful with where I place the colors since this is such a tight area. But as usual, these outlines are just guidance to what you need as reminder or better positioning when you're painting. So if you don't need to outline it, but there are any other areas that you feel like you need to divide up or sketch, you can add them on to your initial outline. There are no set rules, and under sketches are just supposed to be there to aid your painting. So next, let's move on to the colors that I'll be using. I'll be using my Cotman palette for this, and the first color is Chinese White, followed with Cadmium Red Pale Hue, Cadmium Red Deep Hue, Cadmium Yellow Pale Hue, Cadmium Yellow Hue, Cobalt Blue Hue, Ultramarine, Viridian Hue, Sap Green, Burnt Umber, Burnt Sienna, Purple Lake, Yellow Ochre, Alizarine Crimson Hue, and Paynes Grey. I'll also be using Bleed Proof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. Okay, let's paint. So firstly, I just want to lightly wet the area for the sky and also the edges where I lined the trees. Then I use a little bit of yellow ochre in a very thin consistency to paint very lightly on top of the tree on the left and just around the arch, but I want to leave the right hand side fairly light. And here I used Cadmium Yellow Pale, followed with a very light consistency of Cadmium Red Pale. I want to pretty much leave out a white circle on the right hand side here. That's why you can see that I'm curving my application of paint, and I just want it to look like that's the light source. While the surface is still wet, I want to use a light consistency of yellow ochre in a very dry brush load because the surface is still wet. It's going to still spread, but I do want it to spread at a very bare minimum. So I'm just dotting using the tip of my brush. You can see how dry my brush is because it's holding the tip very tightly, and I'm also going to soften the edges with a slightly damp brush. Next, I'm going to add a little bit of sap green to the yellow ochre, and I'm going to do the same by just dotting using the tip of my brush to create leaf textures. And after this, I'm going to follow it up by adding Viridian into the previous mixture to add an even darker green on the right hand side. I'm not waiting for each color to dry, so you can see that the colors are spreading into each other very softly. You might also notice that there's quite a lot of negative space that I'm leaving here, some larger, some smaller. For the very large ones, I want to just add even finer brush strokes to close them up but not fully, and this will just make the tree look a bit more natural. Next, I'm going to add Purple Lake into the previous green mixture, and this will just create a brown. And I'm going to use this to paint branches. As you can see, for the larger white spaces, I've added branch shapes in between them, and I'm also going to paint the tree trunk and the loose branches as well. Next, I'm going to create a different shade of green by mixing Cadmium Yellow Pale, Sap Green with Yellow Ochre. And I use the tip of my brush again, just dotting it to create leafy textures. And I'm going to paint the edges, a couple of layers of them, and follow this up with a darker green, just like what I did with the tree. But this time I'm going to add Viridian burnt sienna with a little bit of burnt umber to create a different shade of green. And this will just make the edges of this bush looks like it's sun-kissed. As I move along to the right hand side, I add an even darker green by adding more burnt umber in the mix, and I'm going to do the same for this bush in front as well. It's okay if some of the mixtures look a bit more brown than others. In fact, I find that this gives a bit more interest to the painting, and I also want to leave out the white negative space again so the bush doesn't look too bulky. Here you can even see me intentionally dotting burnt umber without the green, just to give that slight change in hue. Next, I'm going to paint a pinkish flowery bush at the back, and for this I used a mixture of Chinese white with Purple Lake and also the cadmium red with Chinese white to create pink and a purple, and then I add a yellow green for this while the paint is still wet, and it's going to somewhat blend with each other, and it will soften the green, and it will also have these different hues, so everything will just look blurred out. After a while, all the colors mixed in my brush, and with whatever was left on my brush with a little bit of yellow-green that I pick up, I'm just going to add another bush behind it. I'm just going to paint the top part and use clean damp brush to blur out the bottom so it looks a bit misty. Then with my liner brush, I picked up a little bit of dark green from my palette in a thin consistency, but with a dry brush load to paint long lines so it looks like tall plants at a distance. I don't want the space in between the tree branch to be completely white, so you can use any shade of green in a thin consistency to add on more leaf textures. I'm also going to use a thicker consistency to paint a bit more leaves at the front as well, so it looks like there are layers of it. With whatever was left on my brush, I picked up a little bit of Purple Lake as well as Ultramarine Blue, and I use a thin consistency to paint the top part of this bush again, but I'm going to continue downwards with just a clean damp brush, just like the bush at the bottom, and this will add on to the misty atmosphere. Here I drew out circles to indicate the rose that I want to paint, because for some reason I thought about painting the leaves surrounding the roses first, but you don't have to draw them out because it's actually easier to paint the roses first freehand, so you know the areas where you want to avoid while painting the leaves. So for the rose, I used a mix of cadmium red with Chinese white with a medium to thin consistency first, and just basically paint circles in different sizes to indicate where I want those roses to be placed. Then when the paint settles and they're mostly dry, I'm going to paint on the leaves like what I'm actually doing here. For the leaves, you can use any of the green mixes you would like to. You can add on any of the browns or any of the yellows to make it look more muted, darker, lighter, and things like that. And I just want to mix them all up around the roses, so it will look like some of the leaves are in front and some are placed at the back in shadow. So I'm kind of working backwards to my instructions here because I kind of thought about it halfway through, and this is what I meant before with the pink. This is just the base color, so no need to worry about details, and I like to just twirl my brush to get a circle, but I also want to leave out some negative spaces for some of those circles so they can look like subtle highlights. From here, you can start to paint the leaves already, or you can also use a thin consistency of Alizarine Crimson and paint more twirls, smaller ones at the center of the roses to suggest more of the shapes. from here, I'm going to paint on the leaves the same way as how I painted the trees and the bushes from earlier, just by dotting with the tip of my brush and changing to different shades of green. But while painting, I want to keep in mind the shape of the arch and also where to stop painting, because when you're in the middle of it, sometimes you just keep on painting and you forget where you're at and you've accidentally gone over certain space. So just be mindful of that. If you want, you can also mark it with pencil, and I did sort of halfway down the arch so I can leave space for taller flowers on the foreground later. Next, I'm going to paint the pathway. So for the pathway on the background, I'm going to use a mix of Sap Green, Yellow Ochre, and Pale Yellow in a light to medium consistency, so the area looks like it's receiving a lot of light. Just like the bushes, I like to also pick up Yellow Ochre by itself and add it on random patches to add variety of hues on the grass. As I move closer to the foreground, going down the page, I'm going to slowly increase the value by adding more Sap Green and also mixing in Viridian with any other dark browns until I reach the bottom of the page. In terms of the application, I'm painting on a completely dry surface and I let my paint run out from my brush. So there are some parts with a dry brush texture. Meanwhile, I'm adding different shades of green while the surface is still wet, so some colors might blend with each other and some parts might be a little bit textured from the dry brush with a little bit of negative space. Now all that's left here are the two spaces on the left and right, and this is where I want to fill with flowers. You can add any flowers you want. Personally, I just made it up randomly since I'm going to paint them loosely. So for this first one, I just created a purple from mixing crimson with cobalt blue, and I'm going to paint random blobs while fanning them outwards. Then I'm going to fill up the space with any dark green mix in a thin consistency first, and I'm going to slowly build it up. You might also want to look for certain flowers to fill in this garden area, and you can make it a bit more detailed if you would like to. For the next one, I'm going to use Cadmium Yellow Deep to paint small petals, mostly spread in a flat way, and I want to vary the size and add a bit of green underneath as the receptacles, followed with thin stems painted with my liner brush. For the next flower, I'm going to use cadmium red, and as for the stems and leaves, I'm going to use sap green, still using the same brush to make them nice and thick this time. Then I'm going to fill in the rest of the area with a dark green mix from Viridian and burnt umber. At the front here, I'm going to paint round shapes using the same purple mix, starting with the edges of the circle. Then I'm going to fill it in with cobalt blue to create a round shape. And I'm going to follow this up by painting leaves with the dark green mix. Once I'm done, I'm going to take a thicker consistency of the dark green mix, and I'm going to paint near the edge of the pathway with a little bit of brown to suggest soil. I'm also going to add a mix of yellow ochre with sap green in a thick consistency to paint in between the flowers and the leaves. Going back to the first purple flowers, I'm going to paint the sides and around the flowers with dark green. Then I'm going to switch to a mix of sap green with burnt sienna to fill in the gaps. It doesn't really matter what type of greens you use, I just want to vary the colors just like what I did with the bushes and the tree. Here on the right hand side, I'm going to paint orange and yellow flowers. I'm making these flowers a bit more open and I'm painting thin petals around them, but still in a very loose way. For the leaves, I'm going to make this one a bit more grassy, then I'm going to alternate the greens just like what I did with the bushes and the other plants. I want the green to be a bit different for this one, so I used a mixture of Viridian with Paynes Grey, so you can also mix Sap Green with Paynes Grey too, or any of the other hues if you want a slight change in the shade or the tone of green. I'm going to fill in the rest of the space with more colorful flowers. I'm going to paint tall flowers using Purple Lake. I'm going to treat this one like faraway delphiniums, and I'm going to play with the height and size of these flowers. On the left, I'm going to add these delphiniums as well as orange roses. Then going back to the right hand side, I'm going to add tall purple daisies on the right from a mix of Cobalt Blue, Cadmium Red Deep, and Chinese White. For the rest of the space, I'm going to fill it with a variety of green to brown tones to represent the stem, leaves, as well as the soil. And I'm going to add more pink roses until all the flowers and the greeneries look nice and packed together. There's still a lot of whites around and the flowers look pretty flat, so I'm going to work on that. I'm going to add finer grassy texture around the flowers with a dry brush load so the grassy texture look more sharp with the dark green, closer to the pathway, and I can paint them a bit more loose as it's closer to the frame of the painting. I'm also going to add details around the arch by painting loose branches and leaves hanging on the arch of the entryway. Going back to the rose bush, I want to add a vignette feel to the overall composition, so I'm going to add dark green around the corners of the rose bush, but I'm still following the same texture with the same brush marks as the base. For the roses, I decided to add a very light glaze of Paynes Grey, and this will just add depth to how the roses are positioned because this light glaze will make it look like some flowers are further in front than others. Now that I've built more details and value around the flowers, the pathway looks a bit too light in value compared to the rest. So now I'm going to glaze on more colors in a thin to medium consistency using the same technique as how I've painted the base color, but I want the bottom to be much darker, so our eyes will be directed towards the entryway. I like to work by jumping around to slowly build the value and get a good enough balance overall. So now that I've worked on the greens to darken them, I want to add a bit more detail to the flowers, but still in a very loose way. For some of the flowers, I like to add shadows by using a slightly thicker consistency of the same color of the flowers and just add on a bit more detail. Or I like to also use bleed-proof white to clear out some areas with the white, so I have white base, and on top of the white I'm going to use the same color of the flowers just to get a cleaner shape. This is of course optional, but I just find that it would be nice to have cleaner shapes on the foreground. After that, I'm going to treat them the same way as I did the roses by adding a glaze of Paynes Grey, especially for the flowers close to the edges to further enhance the vignette of the overall composition, and I'm doing this in a very light consistency so it's not too overly dark. This is the adjusting portion of the painting, and I'm just going to keep building on the colors until it's balanced enough. Here I also decided to add little leaves on the sides just for added detail, and once I'm happy with it, I'm just going to unmask the sides. After I unmask the painting, I find that the sides look kind of imbalanced with the darker value, so I decided to just add more of those dark greens along the sides. Honestly speaking though, I did feel like I added a bit too much in the end, but at the same time, I also feel like it draws your eyes more towards the entrance, so it's really up to you how far you want to take this and just be mindful of that. So that's pretty much it for this painting. I was actually kind of scared in the beginning to paint this because there were just so many different elements included in the composition, but once I got into it and worked in small sections, it became very doable and I really enjoyed it. Like usual, all the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in my description box. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!